primarily a question addressed to Pilvi, but I think it's also addressed to the participants in the Canadian project. I'm, as a result of listening to Pilvi's presentation, I'm now struck by an absence from the Canadian presentation and a semi-absence from her own presentation. You know, when you go to the restaurant to meet Pierre, you only notice that Pierre's absent if you expected Pierre to be there. And here's a strange absence, but maybe it's not so strange. You know, many years ago, I think it was Pierre Trudeau who spoke of the difficulties of a country, which is a small country living next to a superpower, the mouse sleeping with an elephant. Yeah. And I saw no indication of that kind of world historical focus, let's call it that, in the reports of the Canadian survey. And then, of course, one of the ways in which Finland is in some ways similar to Canada. I mean, Finland is a small country, whereas Canada is a medium-sized country, but Canada used to live right next door to a superpower, which is still a very important power. And Finland, since 1923, has lived next door to, first of all, the Soviet Union, and then to the Russian Federation, which, of course, is much, much larger than Finland. Now, of course, you do refer to the Winter War and the Continuation War. And here's the question I have for you, and perhaps the Canadian researchers will have some reflections to add. To what extent do the people with whom you interviewed, whom you surveyed, of course, they spoke about events. They spoke about the Civil War, and they spoke about the Winter War, and they spoke about the Continuation War. To what extent do they speak about the situation of the country which lives next to a much larger country that is persistently, perhaps, problematic for them? You know, there's a pejorative term in English, Finlandization. The Finlandization, this was much disapproved of by the U.S. State Department. Finlandization was basically getting along with the Soviet Union well enough over the periods into World War II. Well, this kind of, to what extent did your interviewees, your survey respondents, speak of this sort of state-state relation? I saw no indication of such a concern in the results reported from the Canadian survey. Maybe the results of the Finland survey would be good.
Yeah, thank you very much. This question mainly shows that in a presentation of 30 minutes, you can touch upon 2 questions out of 30 in a survey. So thank you. I can actually explore something more thanks to your question. Of course, both the question of Finlandization in particular and the being neighbors with the Soviet Union figure in various questions of the survey. They did figure in those 2 that I showed to you, but I didn't go into particular details. What was probably surprising was that even in the Second World War questions, the sort of special Soviet aspects weren't stressed as much as patriotism and other aspects. As far as the Finlandization is concerned, it comes up in our political public debates regularly still. So one would have assumed that the question concerning, because we asked something like in one of the other questions that you didn't see, that how important is the Finlandization for today, and should we still try to come into terms with it or something like that. It was sort of 3.5 question, as I say, so no strong reaction either in favor or against. Same was true for questions concerning the future expectations, where we asked, for instance, I was trying to look, as I said, I have brought my manuscript in order to be able to check, but for instance, we asked about whether the, how much the end of the Cold War and the collapse of Soviet Union influenced life since then up to now, and how much will being neighbors with Russia influence life in the future. So the latter one was much less approved, so that in other words, that Russia has much less influence in the future developments than it had until the end of the Cold War. And in the interviews, so these are from the survey, but in the interviews, I was also surprised by this absence that you actually mentioned, because in several interviews I recall that at the end, towards the end of the interview, I would ask, well, is there something you would like to say about having been neighbors with the Soviet or Finlandization? And the reaction, for instance, to Finlandization was very often, oh yeah, it was there, I don't think it's important anymore. So it doesn't come up actively, that's my point, probably.
Just reacting to the absence of this issue in the Canadian study. Canadian study did not probe any specific events, historical events or issues. We did have at least one open-ended question that asked respondents about an important event, person in their lives. And I don't remember any kind of pattern of references to being next to a superpower. Typically, the most important events in people's lives were related to their personal or family events. So, but I leave it up to my other colleagues if they want to react to that.
Just to answer the question about data from a different survey, the Canadian Election Survey, 1988, free trade election. The question is, should Canada be closer to or more distant from the United States? This question has been asked every election from 1988 on. And in 1988, lots of people are on this side or on this side. When you ask that question today, the most common answer is about the same as now. And so I think that question of Canadian-U.S. relations is a lot less important to the average person than it is to the people who write in the newspaper. And I think that this change has happened over time.
So perhaps it's just a background condition.
Yeah.
And we tend not to notice background.
Yes, maybe it is.
Oh, sorry. There's a question to Pilvi. Pilvi, post-survey, I've actually become very interested in the ways in which journalists and popular historians shape historical consciousness. And also national myths. And so I'm wondering, when you were discussing the person who has had, the writer, who's had a big influence, the Unknown Soldier and Under the Northern Star, what sort of historian that, what, is it a novelist or a writer or?
Yeah, he's a novelist called Lima, L-I-M-A, who wrote in the 1960s, came from a very sort of labor, uneducated background, and was certainly considered more left-wing writer than right-wing. And when his books appeared in the 60s, certainly caused a debate, but more they of course coincided with the student movement and all the rest of that. So that opened, in a way, a new chapter in the ways we would approach these grand narratives of the past. But what I think is interesting is that it has lasted. So it's not only me born in mid-70s, but it's also my younger brother born in late 80s, who's read them all and would be able almost to quote sentences. So that the lifespan of those novels, I think, is unusual and surprising.
It's interesting that it's a novel.
Yeah.
Not a historian.
No, not a historian, but I mean, I think we would have probably a public historian here.
I will do the same, but it would be better if I am translated, so I will ask my question in French. Ma question s'adresse à la fois à l'enquête canadienne, australienne, et aussi, s'il y a des représentants de l'enquête américaine. Je voudrais savoir si, dans votre enquête, vous avez trouvé des traces, des gestes de reconnaissance des massacres qui ont accompagné l'arrivée des Européens, et qui ont été des gestes qui ont été importants en Australie, en Nouvelle-Zélande, au Canada dans la dernière décennie, si ces gestes-là ont un impact, sont intégrés dans la façon de voir l'histoire, appropriée comme faisant partie d'une histoire qu'on continue. Mon cher Jocelyn, excuse-moi de te mettre sur la question universelle, effectivement.
Okay, this question is for all those who have done surveys of the Australians, Canadians, and Americans in their past. You just want to know if in the, I guess, open-ended questions you have found any trace of some remembering or reminiscence or thinking about violence that happened when I suppose the Europeans came over either in Australia, in Canada, or in the United States. Is it still, in a way, if I understand well the question, an act of reminiscence in the way people see the past and, of course, the link between the past and the present? Okay, and if this reminiscence is still alive, does it have any impact in the politics of recognition, politics of dealing with this particular past, this troubled past?
In the Australian context, reconciliation is a major social issue and a sort of a semi-official policy. In Australia, there's a National Reconciliation Council, which is a private organisation. It's a not-for-profit, but it's supported by federal government and state governments. So the issue is very much alive, and in our survey we had some very strong responses from not huge numbers of people, but significant numbers of people. For example, around anniversaries, when we said, what do you think about anniversaries? And they said, well, what do you think about Australia Day? Some people said, I don't call it Australia Day, we call it Invasion Day. And there are a lot of Indigenous people call Australia Day Invasion Day, and that came out through Indigenous people that we talked to, very, very strong amongst the Aboriginal community, obviously, but across a fairly broad cross-section of the Australian society generally. I can't think of the exact figures, but there would have been 15-20% at least of people that responded to issues around that were very, very aware of and concerned about the impacts of colonisation, initial aggression, the destruction of Aboriginal societies and tribes and things like that. So that's just a short answer.
In the American and the Canadian studies, there are references to violence against Aboriginal peoples, and but mostly there are references to injustice against the Aboriginal people and how they the misrepresentation of the past by the mainstream historians. This is reflected in how much trustworthiness Aboriginal people in both countries, both in the U.S. and Canada, associated with formal sources of information about the past.
Yeah, exact reverse of the rest.
Kevin Key, sorry. My question is addressed to those who did the studies in each of the different countries, and I'd be interested to know as well what you think about the study in the United States as it concerns what I'm about to ask. This week, some research led by Tony Wagner and others got a lot of press, and basically the takeaway was that a part of the reason that Finland's educational system has been extraordinarily successful is that there is a great deal of faith in the system by the Finnish people. And so, because teachers in Finland are seen as professionals who are very good at their job, because the schools are generally viewed to be doing their job very well, Finland's success follows from that. So my question is this: is there any relationship between how people see in these various countries the quality or the veracity or the trustworthiness of the history that they learn in schools and universities their view of how those school systems are doing their job. So to rephrase, if you think that your school system is effective, are you more trustworthy of what your school system, K-12 and undergrad as well, tells you about history?
Just from the Australian perspective, Paul and I wrote a specific article in the Journal of Australian Studies about school history. School teachers actually had quite a low ranking in terms of trustworthiness, and there are various reasons for that. Someone mentioned physical education people teaching history in one of the earlier sessions, and there's a joke in the States, what do you call a history teacher, coach. Certainly in Australia, a large number of people teaching history, probably around 40%, don't have any formal qualifications in history, and that number's going to grow exponentially when the new national syllabus kicks in because there aren't enough history teachers. People's personal experience varied from having a wonderful history teacher that put them on a life track of actually engaging with the past and loving history and that sort of thing, right through to people that just hated history at school, it was boring, blah, blah, blah. Very, very diverse responses, but I think overall teachers only got a ranking of about 15 or 14% compared with museums that were 60%. Yeah, so there's structural and other issues there.
Yeah, thank you. I was just checking one of the slides I had was comparing this trust issue, and there it's true Finland actually has much higher level in terms of trust for the school history teaching than the other countries. And probably your analysis is quite correct. What is different compared to many countries in our education system is that, for instance, all history teachers would actually have a degree in history from the 7th grade onwards. And typically, I would say, of course, here I'm talking also as a university teacher, but we tend to get extremely good students to study history, so they become exciting teachers. So they become very often the most popular teachers of their schools. If I may, I would add that I think this question of trustworthiness is a more complex one, though, because another country that I've been involved in research, as I mentioned, is Bosnia and Herzegovina, where history was divided after the war into the sort of 3 war camps, more or less. So you would have 4 million people and 3 history textbooks with very different interpretations, rival interpretations of history. And when in the Youth and History survey, there was one question concerning the trust for textbooks and trust for history teachers. The Bosnians ranked among the highest when compared to 30 European countries in their trust for their history textbooks in that particular situation where anyone either from Bosnia or from outside could say that, well, these are rather sort of political manifestations than textbooks. So I think so many aspects actually come in when you talk about trust in history textbooks.
Oh, you wanted to add something?
I just want to briefly add, the world since last December, and the PISA results have been announced. PISA 2009 results have been announced. The world has been looking for the high-performing countries like Shanghai and Finland and a few other countries like Canada. It's another hypothesis about the success level of education in Finland. Among many others, people have been trying to find some correlations that work in Finland and see it less replicated in the United States and bring the average up. So it's just another hypothesis in my opinion. I don't see any justification for or explanation of the mechanisms of how that works.
Yes.
On the thing about teachers and trust, I actually think the American book did a disservice to teachers. Not a great disservice, but somewhat of a disservice. One of the problems with the question is that they're asking people about sources of information that they trust, and they're right there, they're next door. But people are casting back to when they were a teenager and trusted nothing. when they're giving their answer about how they felt about it.
Absolutely.
So I mean, that's one thing. The second thing is that we asked in our survey, was there an event, a time, a place, a teacher, a class that really turned you on to history? And about half of our respondents said, yeah. So against this sort of like, we don't trust teachers, there also is this other narrative that sort of says, there was a teacher, there was a class, there was an event in a classroom that really turned me on to history. So there is also this other theme coming through there as well. So I think if we're going to talk about the lack of trust in teachers, we should also recognize the problem with the question and this other theme that's in the background.
It seems that no matter the trust that you have in regard to your teacher course that you are following, and I'm thinking here more about the national history course, has a deep impact in the historical consciousness of kids. At least in Quebec, I have done many research about the way kids think about the historical past of Quebec before and after having followed the national history course. It was prior to the reform, and the change is considerable.
I'm going to move a bit away from teaching, but I want to come back to the question Monsieur Rousseau posed about Aboriginal. I had the privilege of going across Canada with the Canadian Museum for Human Rights, and we talked to almost 2,000 people from coast to coast to coast. And part of that speaking was a series of roundtables. So this is anecdotal evidence, it's qualitative. But there were a series of roundtables, and we would share roundtables. And one of the questions was, what do you think is the most important issue facing Canada today? Now, this is in the context of human rights. They're coming to talk about rights and responsibilities. But what surprised me was that from Scarborough to Vancouver to the Arctic to the Maritimes, the issue identified at the roundtables was the reconciliation between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal Canadians. So I'm not so sure it's a history of violence here, but there is a sense that the injustice must be righted, and this notion of reconciliation. And the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Canada is a legislative commission. It's the result of a court settlement for the residential schools, and this has gained a huge understanding among many Canadians. So I think it's very interesting that and this is a very new, I think if you'd gone about 20 years ago, that would not, 15 years ago, 10 years ago maybe, that would not have been the expression of what is the issue facing Canada today.
That's very much the case in Australia. We've had some fairly major reports in the last 2 decades bringing them home about stolen generations in the late 80s, was it Paul? 96. 96, that's right. And a couple of other major reports that millions of dollars were spent on developing them. And Paul and I have been thinking about the ways in which this has actually had an impact on collective memory amongst various Indigenous groups too.
My name is Sam Allison. Pilvi, I'd like to ask you about the conflict. In your study, you said that fiction was not trusted by ordinary people, yet you also said that the novel about the Second World War was in fact very influential. And it leads me, to Lincoln's comment that Uncle Tom's Cabin caused the Civil War. Mark Twain on the other side said it was Sir Walter Scott, with the romancing of chivalry, who should have been shot because he caused the Civil War. But Scott, in my view, is probably the most influential British historian who ever lived. He's a novelist, but he created medieval England with Ivanhoe, Robin Hood. He created, where I lived in Scots, he absolute menace. He created the clan system, and everybody believed in it. It's a lot of nonsense. They didn't wear kilts except in the Highlands. I'm a Lowland Scot. We have a clan, we have a tartan, and we pretend. And we believe in the pretense. That's the problem with fiction. But my question to both of you is, why didn't you include historical fiction in your survey? For the Canadian one, I was surprised it didn't include Longfellow's Evangeline. I think it's probably got more sympathy for the Acadians than anything. If you look at the reality of the Acadians, I don't want to get into this, but they brought much of it on themselves by killing British soldiers, which wasn't a good idea at the time. But so my question to both of you is, why wasn't fiction included in your assessment of public memories? I think fiction shapes national memories. Think of Breaker Morant, in Australia, Gallipoli, the movie, Scotland, Braveheart, caused an enormous upsurge of nationalist feeling. So fiction is actually incredibly important. One of the problems in Canada is we don't make good fiction, and I think that would be a good fiction about Canada in the war. Sorry, movie fiction. To make good movie fiction, we have a much better national perspective.
Thank you. A little bit same as with the question about Soviet Union and Finlandization. Thank you. So one can explore one's results a little bit more because everything can't be included in a 25-minute presentation. We actually had a question also, open question. Please mention works of art, literature, plays, films that have moved you, I can't remember exactly, have moved you recently and also why. And in the list, two by far the most popular ones were the two titles that also then appeared as part of the story of the 1918 and the Second World War. So the open question, of course, appeared first in the survey and then later on those questions where it was mentioned. And then coming back to the question of trust, when I said that the fiction was not trusted as much as, but trusted more than, for instance, the stories of politicians. So where do you put the trust? What is being trusted and what is not is, of course, always an open question in this kind of survey, so it's all relative. I think it is interesting that the trust level of fiction is that high as it is in our surveys. It would be surprising if it was as high as, for instance, let's say, factual books and history.
Paul, do you want to add anything?
Not particularly. We did ask about books that people read, whether it was autobiography, biographies, creating non-fiction, fiction. And I think you're right that it does have a powerful impact, particularly when things are taken from books that are then turned into films, and like Break Moran, etc. Had a significant impact in Australia when it was first sort of published in book form, but again when the film came out, it was huge. There's also different historical periods that I think Break Moran would not have been made wasn't made as a film, and probably would not have been made as a film in the 1950s or 30s, when Australia was a much more Anglophile sort of place, and it did come out in a period after significant neo-nationalism.
Yes, I'm just going to follow up on the question of fiction. We did ask the question, and David mentioned it in his report this morning, so perhaps you didn't hear that, but we did ask the question about what books and so on. But then we did get gratuitous comments. In fact, Braveheart came up, and it came up in the context of a deeply rooted, or a Canadian who had gone to Scotland and was interested in Ian Rankin and Braveheart, and now was working on Johnny MacDonald. I mean, that's what we're getting as a kind of hodgepodge of interest. And in some of it's fictional, some of it's movies, and then some of it's, working in the archives. And so the movie, which is also fictional, as well as books, are extremely important, but people are clever enough to know that it's fiction. It doesn't mean that what we talked about yesterday, the emotional aspect of it, you're going to get a lot more emotion from these novels and movies than perhaps you are from a dry as dust Canadians and their past. 48% do this, 36% do that. And so they interact with each other, and as David will tell you, then they'll go to the internet and check it out after they've gone to a movie or read a book and so on. So these are really interesting and complex ways that people engage the past, and we underestimate the public if we think they're that simple-minded.
And then there's always the, if it's not true, it should be factor.
Okay, I think that time is up. Our speakers traveled long distances to come here, so I'm very grateful and pleased to have them here. Please join me in thanking them.